Experience the most efficient system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to meet your crop's needs with Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST.
Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Shaun Haney here from Real Agriculture and joined by Jacob Shapiro. He is head of geopolitical and macro research at the Bespoke Group based in New Orleans, Louisiana. And it's time for another episode of the Frontlines podcast. Jacob, how are we doing?
Oh, I feel like I make the same joke every time I come on with you, Shaun, that it's a boring week in the world, and what could we possibly find to talk about? But there's literally so much this week, I feel stupid even trying to make the joke.
Yeah, well, there definitely is lots happening. I don't think we can go very far without, we need to talk about what exactly happened with these exploding pagers. Something, and I don't want to make light of it. It just felt like James Bond or something out of like a spy movie. This is absolutely incredible. What's your take on what exactly has transpired this week?
There's a more local take in the context of the Middle East and what's happening with Israel, and then there's also a broader take about what this means globally. The first thing we should say is we don't have a lot of details here. The Israeli government is not even officially taking credit for this, as is their custom. They don't like to take credit for any of these things. It's an incredible act of tradecraft from an intelligence services point of view. I mean, tactically, operationally, sheer brilliance. Strategically, I'm not quite sure where it gets Israel, and that's the more local point to make here. Israel has been involved in a military campaign in the Gaza Strip since the October 7th terrorist attacks. It is now opening up a second front on its own choosing in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. So we had the pagers explode on Tuesday. We had the walkie-talkies blow up on Wednesday. And then Thursday, we've got Israeli jets just bombing the heck out of southern Lebanon, and Israel moving military forces from Gaza to the northern border because they say they want to get people back to their houses there. A lot of people have left because of the rocket fire that is coming from southern Lebanon. The Israel Defense Forces are not built for long extended campaigns like this. They are built for shock and awe. If you look back at all of Israel's most successful wars, it's punch them in the nose in 2 weeks and go home. They've been mobilized since October 7th, and now they're going after a second front. So there's that strategic question that I have. The broader sort of global issue here is, to me, this breaks sort of global norms and taboos. As far as we know, what happened was the Israelis set up some shell companies in Europe and some Hezbollah guys. I would love to know who is the Hezbollah guy in charge of beepers. Like, do they have a head beeper person inside the Hezbollah? Anyway, we don't have to go into that.
He's in trouble.
But so he purchased, or whoever these people were, they purchased beepers from what turned out to be Israeli shell companies that it looks like were based in Hungary and which had a license from a Taiwanese company to make those beepers in Hungary. And they put explosives inside of the device and then sent them on. How the walkie-talkies and the other things that have exploded worked, we don't even know. We only know sort of beeper supply chain there. But the reason I say it breaks global norms is, and I've tried to apply this in a couple different ways. Imagine that there's a shipment of wheat that is going to a country that your country has a conflict with. And let's say that the intelligence services get on that ship and lace the wheat with some kind of poison. If you want to get really dystopian here, what if you can sort of bioengineer a virus that is supposed to affect only a particular person or a particular family, or if you want to get really sinister, a particular ethnic group? And what if you can embed that in an export that goes to that particular country? What if it's a dirty bomb? What if it's a sort of nuclear device that you're able to get in there? There's a whole Pandora's box here that it opens up. And we've talked for a long time about deglobalization and about multipolarity and international competition. Trade has always been respected in that context. Like, it's absolutely amazing that you and I can open up a laptop that has been designed in California with chips made all over the place and all these different components. And it's not nefarious. Nobody is using it to blow us up or do all these other sorts of things. And here you have Israel doing exactly that. So there's a more local issue here. Like, what does this mean in the context of what Israel is doing in the Middle East? Strategically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And then I think the broader issue is, what does this mean for global trade? What does this mean for supply chains? If you're a company that manufactures an electronic device, do you now have to make sure that your devices aren't getting explosives laden in them by some other actor? I mean, like, that's now a real thing that we have to worry about. So I'm trying not to be too paranoid about it, but it takes us to a very dark place, I think.
Yeah, I thought about a few things, but you have taken it further, things I didn't even consider. But Does this activity this week and this tactic, does it make it more difficult for the U.S. to put a lot of support behind Israel, or how does it impact that relationship?
You might have seen that Germany already suspended weapons exports to Israel. I don't think this is going to thing that stops the United States from supporting Israel. Um, if what Israel has done in the Gaza Strip has not stopped it, I don't think the United States is going to push really hard on this particular thing. I don't think most countries know what to think of this. I was asking my business partner actually today on my own podcast earlier, and I'll ask your listeners and you too, if anybody can think of one, please let me know. Can you think of a similar thing that has ever happened? Can you think of an analogy or any kind of similar circumstance? I really can't. It's very hard for me to come up with, okay, well, this corresponds to this other thing, so we have some historical context. So I think a lot of governments are looking at this thinking, we don't know how to react to this. We don't even have the toolkit to react to this. The other part of this is when you get in the realm of cybersecurity and hacks and this sort of thing, there are unwritten rules, sort of like mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, where a lot of the reason you don't see state on state hacking is because once you cross that Rubicon, you know that you're going to get it back in turn. And so much of our systems are built on these things that, you could get chaos relatively quickly, like a Fight Club scenario. It feels to me like this is traipsing on some of those red lines. And this again goes back to the local issue. Israel is rightfully so, I think, patting itself on the back for what was an incredible mission operationally and tactically, but they're going to be the first ones who are going to be the target of this in the future. If I'm Iran's intelligence services, I'm just going to say, okay, let's do it back to them. And is Israel going to be able to manufacture phones and computers and everything else for its population that they can be 100% sure the supply chain hasn't been interfered with by some other actor? Like, you start to go down the list there, it opens up some really disturbing questions. So I have more questions than answers. And I've a couple of people I've talked to have said I'm making too much out of this. But this is one scenario where I feel like normally my job when I come on, Shaun, is to say, this is not important. The media is making too big a deal of this. This is not that big of a deal. Today, I'm like, no, I've literally never seen anything like this before, and I don't know how to think about it. And if I'm advising companies on supply chains or even high profile individuals on particular risks to their person right now, personal security, there's a whole Pandora's box of stuff we have to think about now that I hadn't even conceived as possible a week ago.
And it's not like, this kind of technology has been here, I would assume, for a very long time. It's just the fact that it wasn't, just because you can doesn't mean you should, wasn't used. Does this give, I guess, air to, Congress in the U.S. saying, "Whoa, see, I told you, we got to be careful here. This is why we shouldn't be procuring any sort of devices, electronics from China, because they could do that to us at a time where we're trying to manufacture more of these goods in the U.S."
This was one of the big reasons why the United States pushed so hard on the Huawei issue and pushed Canada and other allies hard on the Huawei issue. They weren't worried, I don't think, or maybe they were and they didn't just say it publicly. I don't think they were worried about cell phones exploding in supermarkets, but they were worried that if you had Huawei telecoms kit in your infrastructure, that the Chinese could be able to listen in, or that they would be able to exert digital influence on different operations. Maybe they could disable key infrastructure points like dams or electric utilities or power plants or things like that using some of this kit if it was in there. So yes, it certainly does give you a real tangible world impact of why you would want to protect your supply chain from something that is manufactured in another country. But I think that the other point to underscore there is just like it's the mutually assured destruction point. Like all of our supply chains, especially when it comes to electronics, they're all intermixed. So it's not like you can just say, okay, we're going to strip out the Chinese hardware and we're going to put in the US hardware or the Canadian hardware and it's done. The US hasn't made this hardware in decades. If you're like trying to make the little radio antennas that go on the radio access points that go in 5G telecoms get, even if you don't want to do Huawei, all that's made in China or it's made in Korea or Japan or some other place. Like we just haven't made these things. So we are so interconnected, and that interconnectedness has created incredible wealth. It's also created incredible wealth inequality. It's created incredible opportunity. It's also created, opportunity for nefarious actors. And the lesson here seems to be that we are leaning more and more into fear about what that interconnectedness does to us rather than the opportunities that it has fostered and the growth and development that it's fostered in recent decades.
Let's move over to Russia, Ukraine. What is the update on the progress of that war?
Yeah, so that war has entered its most dynamic phase really since the war started. Um, and it's an example of both sides trying to hit the other side where they're weakest. So Russia has made this a slow grinding conflict in eastern Ukraine, putting numbers up against superior Ukrainian weaponry that they've gotten from the West, and it's working for them. The Russian strategy is to just outsuffer everyone until nobody is left and until they can just take the land themselves. You might remember Ukraine had a counteroffensive in the east that went terribly last year, and things were looking pretty dire. So, what has Ukraine done? They have hit Russian territory. All of Russia's forces were focused on, eastern Ukraine. So now Ukraine is using its superior weaponry, its mobility to hit a lightly defended part of Russia and to take territory from Russia itself. And they're still running around in Kursk, conquering land and making things very, very problematic for Russia. Ultimately, this is a question of who blinks first and whose weakness is going to affect them more. And I think Ukraine is more exposed here. Like I said, Russia's strategy at this point in the conflict just has to be to outweight everyone. They have to trust that their superior numbers and material are going to win out against Ukraine, which has fought valiantly and very skilledly and all these other things, but which is showing signs of fatigue, which is still dependent on the West, and now is having to take the fight into Russian territory, go on the offensive rather than the defensive, which is not necessarily a sign of strength. It's a sign that Ukraine had to do something to change the war because it wasn't going well for them. So, where it goes from here, nobody knows. I don't know either, but it's going to be about those two weaknesses against each other. It's going to be about Ukraine's inability to kick Russia out of eastern Ukraine versus Russia's inability to defend all of its borders. If you want to be optimistic, your hope would be, well, maybe this means they can negotiate. Maybe it's, trade Russian territory for Ukrainian territory. I don't think it's going to be that way. I think it's going to be a fight until the very end. And I think especially for farmers, the thing to think about here, I've been wrong about this for the past couple of years, so take it with a grain of salt. But when the war started, Ukraine had just had a bumper crop. They had sort of front loaded a lot of inputs that they needed, like fertilizer. And the war also caused a lot of bottlenecks. So you had lots of stores build up in Ukraine. Most of those stores have been depleted. The fertilizer supplies that have been built up have been gone. This is probably going to be our first real year where we're going to see what the impact of this war is going to be on Ukrainian production. We've had those artificial things keeping that less dire than somebody like me thought it did in the last year or two. Maybe I'm wrong again. Maybe the Ukrainians can outproduce. Maybe the Russians are going to produce more. Maybe they're going to figure out a way to get fertilizer from somebody else. But this is the largest land war since World War II in Europe. It continues to grind forward. And I just can't believe that we're not going to see that reflected in some of the ag output from this part of the world. We haven't seen it yet, but I have to think the cumulative impact of that is going to build.
I finished New York Times writer David Sanger's latest book about Cold Wars. And one of the things that he says about this war is, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially Zelensky's only way out is to drag everybody into World War III. Do you agree with that? Or is there no truth to that? Or what's your thoughts?
I don't know that I agree with that because World War III, and I'm not even sure that's even possible, even if that is if that's his only outlet to victory, then he already lost because the United States and European countries have already showed they're not going to be dragged into World War III. They're going to give Ukraine weapons and training and all these other sorts of things, but they're not going to commit their own troops. They're not going to open up nuclear weapons. They're not going to intervene directly. So if that's the only path to victory, I just don't think it's going to work. I think if you listen to Zelensky and if you think about Ukraine's position, it's ironic we were just talking about Israel and Hezbollah. The Israel model is the one to more closely think about, where Israel in 1948, when it declared independence, was surrounded by enemies on all sides. Nobody gave it really much of a shot fighting off those enemies. And yet, with a highly motivated, highly militarized society, it was able, with inferior numbers, to push back against a much larger enemy and formed a state that was in a constant state of military readiness and defense to try and push back against all of the enemies that it had on its borders until it was strong enough that those enemies had to recognize it, like Egypt did and like Jordan eventually did. So I think it's right to say that, Zelensky has talked about retaking eastern Ukraine. I don't see that happening in any meaningful way unless the Russian government collapses, which is also a scenario on the board, by the way. Like when Prigozhin marched on Moscow, I thought maybe we were getting that scenario. It looks like there's more resilience there than the Prigozhin episode would have indicated to us. But I don't see any problem imagining a highly militarized rump state of Western Ukraine with European support that is going to defend itself at that kind of level. The question, I think, is whether can Ukraine cut Russia off from Crimea? Because if Ukraine can cut Russia off from Crimea, then you can really just say, okay, fine, have the East, and Europe is going to support us. And if we have Crimea, or at least Russia doesn't have control of Crimea, at least the Black Sea is open to us, theoretically. We can actually move things in and out of the Black Sea without having to make sure that the Russians aren't going to blow us up every other second. Add to that the introduction of F-16s and air power to Ukraine's armaments. They're just getting the first shipments of F-16s. You can kind of imagine how that goes. So there's no going back to the Ukraine of pre-war. That Ukraine has been destroyed, and Eastern Ukraine will never be the same. There's those centers are being depopulated. A lot of them have gone to Poland, not even to Ukraine itself. But I do think there is a future for Western Ukraine as a sort of highly militarized, motivated state in a constant state of readiness to defend itself against Russia. I think that's the future that Zelensky has to move towards.
Back home in North America here, we've got a U.S. election that has had numerous turns of, it's been like some sort of a novel that we're watching in real time, one way to put it. What are we, 6 weeks away? November 4th, I believe is the date. So we're getting closer here in the back end of September to the actual election day. Obviously, you had said previously when we had talked on this podcast that this would be the greatest geopolitical event of the year. Do you still believe that?
No, I'll walk that back a little bit. I do think it's the event that a lot of different countries are looking at and sort of waiting to make moves based on what happens in the U.S. But as we get towards the end of the year, I find myself more introspective. And I think the thing that historians will write about 2024 before they even mention the U.S. election will be the shutdown of shipping through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and the inability of the much vaunted U.S. Navy to stop a ragtag bunch of Iranian-backed Houthi militants in Yemen from stopping global shipping. Like, I think when we're looking back at the history of 2024, that might very well be the most important thing. With the U.S. election, it's so hard to become desensitized to it because it's just been in our faces for so long here in the United States. But one of the things I've been saying to different audiences lately is, look, no matter who wins, you're getting an ideological, demagogic populist who wants to blow out the government deficit and engage in protectionist economic policy. So, there's different varieties of that, and we could talk about whether a Trump administration is a threat to the republic, or if, a Kamala administration is a threat to wealth with some of her crazy things, or some of her crazy policies that she's put out there that I don't quite understand. But at the end of the day, the economic policies that these two parties are offering are actually not that different. They've converged on protectionism and America first. They just want to do it differently. Trump wants to do tariffs. Kamala Harris wants to do, taxes on unrealized capital gains. Okay, we're still talking about the exact same thing. And I think the impact especially for ag producers, is net the same. You've got a protectionist government that probably doesn't have your best interests at heart necessarily. They want you to export more at the same time that they're raising tariffs and protectionist measures against the same countries they want you to export to. Something's there is not going to work.
Yeah, and as trade is impacted because countries retaliate or say, well, we're not going to buy from you, and exports are threatened. There's already a huge agricultural trade deficit in the United States, I think with around $60 billion. Then the two parties, the fight will be who can financially support them the most through ad hoc payments. That's the next stage of this is ad hoc government support programs. It's a really fascinating time when U.S. agriculture knows that they are so reliant on trade, but neither party is really talking about a lot of trade except keeping it out.
Yeah. One way in which the election is, I think, crucially important that I don't want to undersell here, and it's something we have talked about this year in the past, is that a Trump administration would have a very different policy towards Mexico than a Harris administration would have. The United States has still been protectionist under Biden and will be under Harris, but they have at least expressed more interest in working with their allies, and especially their immediate neighbors, which is Mexico and Canada. The Trump administration has not talked about that with Mexico. The Trump administration has talked about 10% tariffs across the board, no matter who you are. The first Trump administration brought us the steel and aluminum tariffs on the basis of national security against Canada. Trump himself has been out there talking about deploying the U.S. military against Mexican drug cartels. There's no Mexican president who's going to look kindly on that sort of direct challenge to Mexican sovereignty. So I do think, from the point of view of the future of the USMCA, U.S. Mexico trade relations, even how Canada works into that, there is a very, very stark difference between those two sides and how the United States is going to behave with its allies, depending on who is in office. And again, for the American farmer or for the Canadian producer, that's a big deal because Mexico is a big consumer for a lot of the things that are being grown in this part of the world.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody else earlier this week where they're Canadian, very concerned about the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico going forward, and Mexico could really be the piece of that triangle that throws this whole agreement into real trouble. And I guess that's easy to point fingers, but what exactly is going on in Mexico?
The same thing that's going on in most of the world. There is a move towards self-sufficiency, especially as it relates to agriculture, but in lots of other ways. And there's also, you have a populist president incoming, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has either close to or very nearly a supermajority. So she's going to be able to make constitutional changes. And she's talked about, things like redistributing wealth, like land reform, like self-sufficiency and things like corn and beans, or in dairy products. So all of those things are pushing forward. And it goes back to, ironically, what we were talking about with the beepers at the very start, because tech self-sufficiency, we've all sort of accepted. Oh, yes, we can no longer be dependent on TSMC in Taiwan for the semiconductors. And we can no longer be dependent on the Chinese for all the things that they manufacture, like the 5G telecoms get and the radio access networks that I was talking about before. Okay, well, China's saying the same thing about U.S. and Canadian food, and Mexico saying the same thing about U.S. and Canadian food, and the low-cost producers becoming Brazil in a lot of these products anyway. So the privileged position that the North American states had is also starting to ebb a little bit. So when you start thinking about, okay, we need tech self-sufficiency, we need biotech self-sufficiency, now we need food self-sufficiency, it gets you to that level of protectionism in the world. Now, I want to just say, I'm not saying that everybody's just going to go home and play with themselves and trade with themselves, but it is that idea of a world where you have these different blocks and spheres of influence. So one of the points I keep making to both American and Canadian producers is, look, there are export opportunities out there. There are trade opportunities out there. But the thing you don't want to do is just expect that you're going to be able to send off products into the market and someone's going to buy them. For instance, if I was selling milk, if I was in a dairy and I wanted to find export markets for milk, I would be obsessed with Indonesia. That looks like a real good market. It's away from geopolitical centers of concern. It's not going to be drawn into China's orbit because it's too big. They just promised they were going to give all of their mothers and young children free milk as part of a big populist handout program. I would be thinking really, really seriously about how to either lobby my government for better trade relations there, or discover direct relationships with people on the ground there going forward. So I'm not saying ignore trade considerably, and I'm not saying that trade is going to be shut down, but it's going to be subject to a lot of these political issues. And the more stories we get like the beepers or the Mexican populists or any of the things that we always talk about, the more that message of self-sufficiency is going to get in there. And the countries that you're going to trade with are going to be ones that have to feel not threatened by you and that have some kind of political incentive to keep that openness.
Yeah, good point. Diversification of markets and continue to build opportunities and options to ship products around the world. Can't just rely on, China and India as the place where everything's just going to go. It's much more fragile than that. Hey, Jacob, you're speaking to ag audiences all over the place. If somebody's interested in having you at their event, how do they do that?
You can just email me at jacob@cognitive.investments directly, and I'm happy to come speak to audiences. You're right that it's not just ag audiences, although there's been a lot of ag lately, but I'm happy to make the time to come speak to any audience that's out there.
Great stuff. Well, that's another episode of Frontlines. If you have any feedback, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.
Cheers.